Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And today we're going to continue forward with another episode of the Photoshop Breakdown series, where I take you through step-by-step the creation of a piece of artwork, showing you the Photoshop documents and discussing the entire process and what went into its creation. And I'm so excited to show you this piece of artwork today because it's the first of its kind in my artwork that I have ever created. After all of these years of photography and Photoshop artwork, I've never created something like this, yet the subject material has been an interest of mine since I was born. And I don't know why it took me this long to create it, but I guess the stars had to, pun intended, the stars had to align to put this into my hands to be able to create it, especially getting the original stock image from a dear friend of mine. So let's dive into Photoshop and take a look at a piece of artwork that I've entitled The Eye of Heaven. And here it is, The Eye of Heaven, and my first astrophotography composite piece of artwork in Photoshop. This is essentially a few pieces of stock put together utilizing some basic tools in Photoshop and utilizing Oniric by Composite Nation to be able to create the realistic glows and light added to the scene in different stages. Part of the reason why I wanted to create the Photoshop Breakdown series is because I want to take you through showing you the final artwork first and debunking the myth that this is difficult to create, or if it is difficult to create, showing you step by step of how it was done, so that as you continue to see those elements put into place, hopefully you get the feeling of confidence that this can be done, that this doesn't have to be this daunting process where you're left alone with simply a vision and going, well, how do I begin? How do I start? I've been getting a lot of comments on various videos on the channel, as well as messages sent to me asking for me to start making content talking about my creative process itself. And as I've come to understand the requests, they are not asking for tutorials of what tools to use or the settings in the camera, but more to talk about the inspiration and the ideas and how I came up with these things. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. And I'm also asking you, let me know in the comments below, is this something that you would like to see a little bit more of in the pieces of work I do, whether it's the Photoshop breakdowns or the other tutorials, talking about a little bit of the creative process and ultimately why these things are being created. Let me know in the comments. And if so, then I'll start trying to find more ways to incorporate that in future tutorials. So space. I want to resist the urge of saying space, the final frontier. I have been a fan of space and the cosmos since I was a child. I loved NASA when I was young. I had all kinds of models of the space shuttle and various elements and ships from NASA over the years. I'm a huge fan of Star Wars and Star Trek. I loved everything about sci-fi and the cosmos. When I would go to the library, I would check out books about space and look at pictures of nebulas and planets and just be utterly mesmerized. And to me, it has always been one of the strongest doorways to my imagination. And I truly hope that somehow in my lifetime, I will get to travel to space, whether it be in orbit around the Earth itself or to stand on the surface of the moon and just look at the cosmos and take it all in. I mean, heck, if I'm ever blessed with mountains of cash, I'll give it to Elon Musk and go to Mars, because how cool would it be to stand on another planet and watch the Earth rise in the distance, to watch the sun rise from another planet, simply just to be in deep space and look out and see all of those tiny little pinpricks of light, and knowing that those are far distant worlds with some talking mouth out there making videos on their version of YouTube, sharing their different experiences and so forth. Space has just been, it's just been such a trigger to me and such a place of imagination for me. And wanting to create something like this piece of artwork has been around with me for a very long time. A few years ago, NASA released this massive library of images that they have been accumulating for years. And when they did, and they're royalty free, you can do whatever you want with them, I was super excited and I thought, this is it. And I spent a couple of hours going through page after page, hundreds of images, looking at pictures and being mesmerized by them, but nothing was leaping out at me. And these images are great, don't get me wrong, but there was something about it. None of them just went, oh, that's it. Like, that's the first layer. That's the center point of focus in design that I want the audience to go to. I'll use this one and start building things around it. It just didn't happen. I, in the past, have learned how to make planets, using Photoshop and basic textures and so forth. And back then it was mesmerizing to me, where I was going to photograph a couple of highly detailed models that I have of the Starship Enterprise, and I was gonna make my own little composite. And I just never did, because I can never find something that would trigger that inspiration. And any kind of sci-fi composite work that I've done now around cosplay, I have found images on Adobe Stock that make good background elements to go to it, but nothing where the stock of the cosmos or space was enough to be the center point where I wanted to create something around that. And that changed for me when I saw this image on Facebook, produced by a wonderful friend of mine named Dawn Lowry. You can see more of her beautiful, amazing artwork by visiting the Instagram account at the link below. Dawn and I met at a workshop that I ran a few years ago. We have since made contact since then. We talk to each other via social media. We've seen each other at different conferences. She's a wonderful human being and a great photographer. And a little while ago, I saw through her travels on social media that she was becoming more and more interested in astrophotography. At first, it was just photographing the Milky Way here on Earth using a camera and a tripod. But then that started to evolve into astrophotography. And I watched her journey of buying all of the equipment that is necessary to be able to take a deep space image like this. This is the Rosette Nebula. It's a part of a larger nebula cloud and cluster of nebula gases and so forth. And the gear needed to create this is not cheap. It's not easy to learn and master. And I've watched her process. You need motors that hold onto the camera and the telescope and rotate the camera a few increments every few seconds so that the camera can be opened and the shutter can be opened for hours upon hours and be kept with the rotation of the Earth so you don't blur out the background, and be able to image something like this. It takes dedication and time. Astrophotography has been something I've been interested in doing myself many years ago, but being completely honest, and I don't mean this to be funny, the reason why I didn't do it is because it involves a lot of mathematics, and I suck at math. I'm horrible at math. And so I was like, you have to know like spatial coordinates and like time of day and degree, like forget it. No, can't you just point it up and go find nebula, take picture of it? No, you can't. So her dedication to this, and you know what? I'm sure she's going to see this video. So Dawn, I'm just going to say this to you. Your dedication to astrophotography, your dedication to artwork is so incredibly inspiring to me. I've said this to you before in different pieces that you've posted over the past couple of years. You have brought the cosmos to us. And it is a gift that I am so thankful to have. Me at 43 years old, or that little kid renting books, checking out books in the library and just looking at those photos, you have created that star stuff that is mesmerizing to me. Thank you so much, my friend, for going not only on the journey of mastering this technology and spending the resources on it, because I know it's not cheap, but dedicating time and energy to mastering this craft and becoming better at it with each 8-hour exposure that you take to be able to capture the Rosette Nebula or other major elements of celestial events and pictures and so forth. So thank you so much, my friend. And thank you for letting me use this image to create something with it and to play around with it. I reached out to Dawn and said when I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is beautiful. Can I use this image and experiment with it in Oniric? Because I wanted to test Oniric with the light and see if I could ultimately give a little bit more dimension and depth to the image. It's a 2D image of a 3D object, and I wanted to use Oniric simply as the dodge and then start painting in different elements as the burn to hopefully bring out a sense of three-dimensionality, as is so often we're used to seeing now in movies and in television with 3D effects. The Rosette Nebula, and especially the colors that are in it, or the colors that are processed and pushed back into it, of what we see with infrared and so forth. I mean, obviously blue and orange, they work against each other. They're opposite against each other on the color wheel. And so this has been a source and inspiration that you have seen, I'm sure, in countless movies and television. And I wanted to take this image and see what I could push with it. So let's go through this image first, and then we'll talk about the composite itself. So at the base, we start with just this image, which is straight out of the processing that Dawn had done with all the imaging software and so forth that she has to do. But if memory serves, she had not processed this in Photoshop or anything to that nature. This is just as raw as you can get, even though this is multiple passes and exposures being put together to produce this image itself as a base. The next thing that I did was I took it into Adobe Camera Raw and used that as a filter to process the image just a little bit. And my goal was first to start with luminosity. Now keep in mind that the foundations of Photoshop that I often work with is color, luminosity, and detail. Those three, no matter what you're doing, what you're creating, what stage of Photoshop you're in, you can always fall back to those three foundations to take the next step. So I started with luminosity by making deep space darker in tone and in luminosity value, so that ultimately the brighter parts of the nebula would stand out even more because they're against a darker background than what we saw with the original image itself. And I changed this layer to be a smart object simply so I could keep track of what was done in the Camera Raw filter, because I do intend on giving this Photoshop document and the other one that I've created to Dawn so she can see all of this. And we're actually going to have a Zoom meeting where I'm going to spend some time showing her everything that I went through to create all of this. It's the least that I can do for her for giving me this wonderful image and all of her beautiful artwork. Please go to her Instagram account and check out her artwork. It's truly stunning and mesmerizing. So inside of Adobe Camera Raw, at the top, I took the shadows down significantly here. I left the white point where it is, and I increased the black point in the image significantly so that ultimately everything would be just a little bit darker, and then we would get a little bit more contrast and separation in these areas where we can start seeing the deeper tones in the colors in the nebula field. And then at the base here, I gave it just a touch of clarity, but I increased the dehaze significantly. I've talked about this in the retouching series. The dehaze is like contrast 2.0 in my opinion, and it definitely creates contrast, but it also creates a deep contrast inside of the colors itself. Now dehaze in the slider is meant to remove quote unquote haze from the image by enriching both the luminosity values and the color values. This is not increasing the vibrance and saturation. This is not increasing the amount of color. It's giving it contrast between its variations of highlight and shadow within the specific colors you see. So the further you take the slider, the more rich these colors become, and the contrast becomes stronger in the background of just white, black, and gray. So that one single slider amongst with shadow and blacks being increased gave us this base that I could start working with. So once that was done, I did the first pass of the nebula into Oniric. Let's take a look at that by itself. So here is the base layer of what I did through Oniric. Now with Oniric, you have two major controls, actually three, let me take that back. You have three major controls in Oniric that control how much Oniric sees of the available light data in the image, and then how much it adjusts that to create the glows and so forth. You have threshold, exposure, and radius. So the first thing I did was I increased the threshold to a full stop of 1 so that Oniric would have access to as much of the light data that it could see in the base image without that being artificially augmented by a levels adjustment layer or curves adjustment layer. So then it saw, of course, a lot of the nebula itself because there's a lot of bright light sources through here that it picked up. But then it started, of course, it saw all the stars and so forth and had to expand outward. Then I took the exposure up just a little bit, which makes all of those available light sources that it sees due to threshold a little bit brighter. But the radius set by default is to set to 20. So that's how far the glow comes outward from the light source itself. It's a bloom. I reduced the radius from 20 down to 1 so that the radius of glow and the glow itself will be so close to the localized source of light that was causing it. So this first pass in Oniric, all I wanted was bright light, and I wanted the glow and the light to be as close to the actual source as possible. I did not want it to expand outward. The more that it expands, it's beautiful, but it is hard to tell where it's coming from. What is the source of that glow? So that was the first pass in Oniric, put into the layer stack on top. The next thing I did was I used a solid color adjustment layer here that is not pure black. As you can see, the brightness is set to 16%. It's a very deep dark gray. And I just simply painted this in anywhere where you see white. That's where I painted it in. It's being revealed. I made parts of the nebula where we see darker tones, like through here in the center and so forth. I made those stand out even more with this solid color adjustment layer that's been set to soft light as a blending mode in Photoshop. So it's not going to completely cover up what's there. It's just making everything significantly darker. This step, along with the step in Adobe Camera Raw, in conjunction with the first pass in Oniric, is essentially a glorified way of dodging and burning this image. I made the darker tones darker. I made the brighter tones brighter. That helps create three-dimensionality or pull it out in the image so that we could hopefully start seeing more layers of this nebula. Then the next pass in Oniric here was simply to, let me turn off the layer mask itself. This was the high threshold of 1. The exposure was set ridiculously high, and the radius was brought back down to, I think, 1 or 2, so that the glow and the light would be very close to its original source, but with the exposure set all the way to its fullest, it blew out all of the strongest available elements of light. I did that on purpose because if we look at it without it, we can see that in periphery edges of the nebula, these sections through here are not nearly as bright as some of them through here. So I essentially just gave Oniric something to work with and boosted everything so that I could then selectively bring it in with this layer mask so that the outer perimeter edges of the nebula itself would just get a little bit brighter and add to the overall glow and elegance of this piece. So with all of those combined, I'm sorry, I did one more pass in Oniric, and this pass was for a general glow and bloom. So this is what it looked like. Again, the threshold is taken to 1. The exposure is bumped up just a little bit, but this time the radius was set to 20. So the glow goes outward. We still see it, but it's a hazy, foggy, illuminated glow that is one way of seeing a bloom and glow. Especially you could potentially see this in space, but I wanted a normal pass of the glow as well as the one that was incredibly localized, which was the first pass in Oniric that I made. And with all of those combined, I was able to make one composite layer at the top, which is this final piece that you see. And that is the layer that I then took into a new document and started creating this composite, which is this document itself. Now, let's start with the base of this and go through it. So the first thing that I started with was a piece of stock that I purchased from Adobe that I believe is a real star field. You can find star fields on Adobe Stock or other stock sites that are 3D rendered, and they have varying levels of fake nebulas and whatever else, or other galaxies thrown into the mix. I really liked this piece because it did not have a lot of noise into it, but of course it's got a bazillion pinpricks of light and stars. This is indicative of a real star field to me, and this is what I wanted to use as its base. Now we can see a few sections here that look like nebula clouds or stellar dust and so forth that could be showing up in the scene. If this is true to life, then maybe they did capture this. Maybe the image maker used multiple stock images that they captured themselves and made this one composite, but ultimately this is the base and what I started with. Then I brought in the nebula, and the first layer of the nebula, what I wanted to do was to try to merge this layer with that background star field from one very important perspective, and that's the stars that you can see in the nebula stock as well as the starfield stock that's at the base of this composite. So if we look at the stars that we see here, there's of course plenty of them and all those little pinpricks of light, but the background that I use for Adobe has so many of them that when I put this layer of the nebula on top, the stars did not match. There was just way more in the base background stock. Now I could have continued looking for a piece of stock from Adobe that had less of those little pinpricks of light and try to work it with the nebula, but ultimately there was a very simple and easy fix, and that is to use blend if. So what I did with this first layer of the nebula was to take in the layer styles and say, take this layer, which is the nebula, let the darkest tones of it start to disappear and fade away so that whatever's below will be visible. So that is the blacker areas of the nebula and the star field. It left all of the bright spots in the center and all, of course, the stars in the outer perimeter as well as inside because those are bright elements of light, but it took all of the darkness away so that the base layer of the star field would be visible. We would see all those pinpricks. So I found a piece of stock that I like for the star field. I put the nebula on top of it and did a blend of so that star field at the base would come up and through the blacker parts of the nebula and we would see all of those stars. Then I simply brought in the nebula again, but I flipped it vertically so that the original top part here would be at the base because I knew I was going to put the Earth somewhere here, and I just wanted a little bit more of a complete picture. The original image from Dawn, if we look at its base, it comes to a harsh stop here. That is essentially a matte line, and we can actually see some of the leftover right here that I didn't paint away because the Earth covered it in my final composite. But I wanted to fill in these sections with just a little bit more of the nebula gas so that from a design perspective, it would look like it was wrapping around the Earth, and the Earth would be one of the central points of focus, based upon the rule of thirds, and then the nebula would be the other anchor point on the opposite side of the document itself. So that's what this layer is. Same thing with the blend if was already activated into it. I just flipped it vertically and used a layer mask to paint it in. These two little spots of white is where it's visible in the final piece itself. Then the layer stock of the nebula put on top in all of its glory. So no blend ifs, no nothing else. It's just simply that one composite layer that we created here at the top, brought in, and then I just used a layer mask so that ultimately anywhere where we see white is where the nebula is being revealed, and then anywhere where it's black, it's went away. And then I just painted away this one harsh spot here was one of the matte lines that we saw as I was building all of this. Then I went to Adobe and found this piece of sky stock for the Earth. Now, this is the original sky stock itself. Let me turn off the transform controls that I purchased from Adobe. So this is obviously a 3D rendered painting or whatever, how it was made. It's got the nice little solar, the light flare. I mean, this could be, you know, some kind of satellite in Earth's orbit way far from the planet taking this gorgeous picture, and then this dude just had access to it. Who knows? I'm pretty sure it's a 3D render. So with this, I liked the colors that I saw in the star fields and so forth, but ultimately what I wanted was that sun flare, and I wanted the Earth itself. So I rotated it. This is North America here. I rotated it so that the sun would be at the top and would, again, I'll add some of that glow and illumination to the nebula itself. So to incorporate the Earth, I had to do it in two different ways. First, I wanted the glow of the sun to interact with the layers above it and below in the layer stack. So I needed to take one copy of that Earth stock and change the blending mode to screen. That tells Photoshop to ignore the color black and lets everything else be there, including light sources. So the light sources will start glowing and interacting with anything below it in the layer stack or above it potentially. So in this case, since the nebula is below it in the layer stack, it let the lens flare of the Earth stock glow on the nebula. So it makes it look like they are one and the same. So that first layer of Earth stock was used simply for that purpose. It has a mask on it just simply to reveal this top part of the Earth with the sun flare itself. Then the actual piece of stock, again, I simply just used a layer mask and made a white circle on the layer mask of black. That's the hide all mask. The white circle reveals just the planet itself. So that it's there. I didn't have to do a blend if or anything along those lines. With the background star field, I just wanted the Earth. Then to give it a sense of realism, I simply painted in some blue glows around the planet itself. You can see these are layers just filled with blue. They have a soft feathered edge, and I just painted them in using a layer mask. Two different ones. Minute shifts in the color, so they aren't the same exact blue, but they're very close to each other, so we can have that planetary glow. But that wasn't enough. I wanted more of the glow to be into the scene, and that's where Oniric came back into play. So I used Oniric again as one single layer here, where I painted a white circle that was the same shape as the Earth in this piece of stock, took that into Oniric, gave it a glow of blue, and then brought it back in and took out the white circle so that we would just have that thin little perimeter of blue. Because if I left the entire white circle, Oniric was making the glow very large and big. But if I just let it be a thin little circle, a thin little ring, there we go, a ring of white. So there's nothing inside, it's just a thin little ring. It gave it a good glow without being too expansive, so we could get that feeling like there's that atmospheric glow coming from the Earth. Then I gave the Earth to Oniric, and Oniric gave me blue glow. I just simply took it into Oniric as it was. It's base stock, just like this, without these glows. And then let Oniric pick up whatever light data it could pick up and start working with it. Now, Oniric is going to pick up the brightest light sources, and that's where all the glows will start, from that center point. So the brightest light source in this piece of stock of the Earth is the sun flare. So it picked it up there and made everything brighter. The more that I increased the threshold, the more that I increased the exposure, it made everything super, super bright in that one area. So ultimately what I wound up with was this piece of stock. And as you can see, the hottest white part here is where the sun flare is. And then I colorized this. So it would not use the existing, Oniric would not use the existing colors in the stock. I changed it to be blue. And I scaled it back and back and back with threshold and with exposure, and actually used the mask option in Oniric to take it away from certain key areas so that I could get that one final glow that we see that's around the outer perimeter edge of the planet itself. I didn't want to leave it like this. I liked the outer glows that I saw, but then we have that orange mix here, which of course the blues and the orange mimic the blues and orange in the Rosette Nebula itself. But I wanted just a little bit more of that glow around the entire planet, and then I made sure to keep it off the bottom of the planet so that we would have more of that realistic feeling, like the planet is glowing, the nebula is the sun source, we see the sun, all these different things. It doesn't have to be true to physics or spatial orientation. It's just art. And then I had a lens flare at the top of the entire layer stack so that we would just have a solitary lens flare like this and put it in there so that there is a little bit of a lens flare going straight up and down, and now we have one going east and west in the piece itself. Then at the top, I made a complete composite layer of everything that was active in this composite so that I could then make this layer itself its own document and go through the artistic retouch process. And all I did in this was utilize some of the basics that we talk about in the retouching series, especially for color grading. So if you've never seen that series, take a look at the card above. It'll take you to that series when you're done with this video. I used a selective color adjustment layer to add a little bit of blue to the space and to the black parts of space in the background, because blue is my favorite color. It's the Pantone color of the year, and it just helped some of the deeper oranges in this stand out a little bit more. I used a high pass filter to increase the sharpness of this. I ran it through Adobe Camera Raw as a final cleanup stage of adding a little bit of white and black to it, a little bit more texture and clarity, vibrance and saturation, and finished up this final piece of artwork itself. So that's it. That's my first astrophotography composite, and it's one that I'm mesmerized by, and I'm pleased, and I love it. And I'm not mesmerized by it because I created it. I'm not that pretentious or arrogant. I truly am not. I'm mesmerized by it for a different reason. And it is that I want to discuss as the final thoughts for this tutorial today. Far too often when we create artwork that we're really proud of, that we're excited about, we want to share it with people, we want to get a print of it, we want to stare at it for hours on end. It's so many various elements of that artwork and how it was created that inspires us to have those feelings. The technical precision, the gear that we use, the circumstances that led us to the photo shoot, the subject themselves and how hard they worked, or the skill set they brought to it, the companionship, the camaraderie, all of that comes into play when we look at a piece of artwork and say, look at all of these hands that went into this, and we appreciate the artwork even more. I appreciate this artwork from one perspective. It's that picture of the nebula and knowing Dawn created it. Not a computer, not a 3D program, not a photo bash in Photoshop with somebody screwing around with tools and layers, but somebody took the time to point a device up and captured something that exists right now in deep space. I'm mesmerized by that picture of the Rosette Nebula. And looking at my artwork that I created with it, it's beautiful to me simply because of that nebula. And knowing that Dawn's dedication made it possible just enriches it even more. I think we need to create more artwork like that every now and again. I'm not saying that I'm going to change my genres now to be astrophotography or something along those lines, but creating artwork where it's just simply to look at something that is beautiful, that evokes emotion and inspires us. And that's the nature of art, of course, and one of its major purposes. But as an artist, as a photographer, and as a business person, too many times our endeavor in artwork becomes exercises in collaboration and involving more and more elements that can work with the art or go against it, so that when we look at the final product, we have a myriad of emotions that go all over the spectrum. When I look at this, I just see beauty that inspires me to continue to create. Please go to Dawn's Instagram account. Please follow it. There's so much beautiful astrophotography there, as well as wonderful images of her travels across the planet. She's a great human being. Please give her some love on Instagram. Please let me know in the comments below. Did you like this Photoshop breakdown? Do you have any questions about what you saw? And ultimately, learning a little bit about my creative inspirations, is that something that's beneficial to you? If it is, then I will continue to find ways to incorporate it in future tutorials on the channel. If you like what you saw in today's video, please make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel, because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.